Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode. In our last episode, we talked about how horses regulate their temperature during hot weather and what happens internally when they're heat stressed. Today, we're going to follow up that conversation and talk about how to feed horses in the heat.
There are definitely some things that we can do in hot weather that might help our horses when they're struggling with the weather, whether it's, you live in Arizona where we're just hot, dry heat, or you live in Iowa where Jill is and it's not so hot, but there's a lot of humidity. So we talked in the last episode about the fact that horses struggle with radiant heat coming from the sun and surfaces around them, and also metabolic heat. So oftentimes we can't do much about the sun other than providing shade and the like, but we can try to help them reduce their metabolic heat burden by potentially changing what we feed them and feeding things that are more efficiently digested and don't generate as much metabolic heat. We can try and use some technologies that are out there, feed ingredients that have been shown to help sort of stabilize the microbial population in the hindgut and strengthen the gut lining. These would be good ingredients to have in our horse's diet. We can obviously encourage hydration, make sure they're drinking enough water, make sure that we're replacing all of that salt that we talked about last time, that crusty salt that's building up where I live when they're out all day long in the heat. And managing flies, which, you might suddenly go, what? Hang on, why is she talking about flies? But in my experience of living here and watching horses in the flies in the summer, they stomp a lot when the flies bug them. And some of them will stomp for hours, like all day, just constant stomping, especially the sensitive or thinner skinned horses. And that stomping obviously takes energy and it's creating movement. So it's generating body heat, but it also is burning calories because it's like walking around all the time. And so then they have to consume more feed to replace those calories. And so anything we can do to kind of, control the flies, obviously the horses are going to appreciate that. I don't think anybody likes being bitten by flies. But just from a metabolic standpoint, it can have a big impact. And I've certainly seen horses that, year to year would lose weight in the summer. I can think of one that we put fly boots on him the next summer and he stopped stomping and he didn't lose weight in the summer, which was really interesting. So I think we don't always think about how much energy it takes to be stomping at flies all day long. So something to think about as we hit the summer months and our fly population is unfortunately increasing.
It's not even the biting flies. I just don't want the flies landing on me. I mean, when you think about it, like a fly landing on you, how much you twitch and like try to get them off, you spend some energy doing that. But yeah, the biting ones are terrible, but the other ones are just annoying.
Right, for sure.
So let's start with hay. In the winter, we feed extra hay to help keep horses warm. So if feeding extra hay keeps them warm, I'm guessing we don't want to feed as much hay in the summer to help keep them cool. Is that true? False?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of onto something there, right? You're right. It generates the horses digest hay through a process of microbial fermentation. and fermentation is not very efficient, and it generates a lot of heat sort of output, which, as you mentioned, in the winter is great because you're generating more heat. It's because it's inefficient that we're generating heat. We talked about that in the last episode, how when you have inefficient digestion or metabolism, energy gets lost as heat. And so that's one of the reasons why we do feed more hay in the winter, is because of that heat generation. Now, obviously, you could reduce the hay intake, and that would sort of reduce the fermentation process there. But we want to make sure we're feeding our horses enough forage to maintain gut function. So you always want to be feeding, at least 1.5–2% of their body weight per day as forage. So I would not advocate sort of, if your horse is eating like 2.5%, suddenly dropping it that much, and making some dramatic change in the amount of hay that you're feeding. Because if your horse is in good body weight on the amount of forage that they're being fed, if you suddenly just go, well, I'm going to reduce the amount of hay that they're eating, then they're going to lose weight because of the calories that they were consuming in that hay that you're now not giving them. So you could potentially replace some of your hay, with calories from another source, perhaps a source of forage that's a little bit more readily digestible, something like, beet pulp or, like a senior type feed that has more fermentable. But generally, I don't, it is something that I do think about in the hot weather, especially with horses that are losing weight. If they're fed a lot of hay, if they're struggling to keep condition on, and I'm feeding them a ton of hay, then I might look at, can we get them some calories in their diet from, a source that's more readily digestible and easier for them to get the calories in. Because I also just think that there's, when it's hot out, I don't want to eat that much, right? And that is one of the symptoms of heat stress in horses and anhydrosis, actually, is that their feed intake goes down. So that can be a little bit of a warning sign. If you're noticing that your horse's enthusiasm for food is sort of waning in the hot weather, you need to pay attention to that. And you might want to start looking at, other ways I can get calories in that are a little bit more calorically dense while still making sure that you're feeding at least 1.5–2% of body weight as forage per day.
I know that horses on high protein diets or alfalfa hay, they urinate more. Is that a consideration in the summer? Do they have to worry? Is dehydration higher in those horses because of that?
They definitely have to drink more on a high protein diet because you have to excrete. You can't store the extra nitrogen that's in the protein. You can't store more protein than you need. And so if you're feeding excessive amounts of protein, so, you mentioned alfalfa diets. I mean, generally horses that are fed straight alfalfa are consuming considerably more protein than they need to every day. And that extra nitrogen gets excreted as ammonia in their urine, and so that their fluid requirement goes up. And again, it's not a very efficient process. It's one of the reasons why I think I've mentioned it in other episodes where, one of the reasons why the Atkins diet, where you eat very, very high protein, or keto, one of the reasons why those diets can help some people is that you're actually burning calories to break down all that protein. And so, that's going to be the case with these horses too. It generates more metabolic heat, so it can actually increase their body temperature a little bit. So I don't love that in the summer. And obviously they're going to have to drink more water to get rid of, to make more urine. And, if you've got a horse that's already struggling to keep up with their water consumption because the weather is hot and they're, at risk of dehydration, that's not great either. And then just the ammonia, the smell when you go into these barns, even in the summer where we are, just can be really quite strong. So the air quality is not great. So I'm not a fan of diets that are super high in protein any time of year, but certainly I don't worry about the horses becoming dehydrated because of the protein. But I think you're just adding an extra level of water requirement into horses that are already, trying to maintain hydration when you feed high protein diets. So there's no benefit to feeding excess protein. And you certainly do add to your horse's burden when you do that in the summer.
In our last episode, we talked about gut upset and what was going on. Do we need to be feeding a biotic? And if so, which one? The pre, the pro, or a post-biotic?
Yeah, I think we have an episode on this, don't we, about different biotics.
Episode 29.
Well, there we are. Yes. So I won't go into too much detail there. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely some research, this kind of gets into sort of some of the technologies that I mentioned, previously of ingredients that might help your horse's digestive tract. And certainly yeasts and yeast extracts have been shown to stabilize the hindgut. And we know that heat stress can negatively impact your hindgut microbial population, narrow the diversity of microbes that are there. So certainly, having those live yeasts and yeast extracts, Saccharomyces cerevisiae specifically, can be very beneficial to the hindgut. We know that postbiotics from yeast species can help maintain microbial diversity in the face of stress. So having those in the diet, is good. If they're live yeast, you're looking at, 50 billion CFUs per day. There are some, we talked at quite length in the last episode about leaky gut, and the fact that you can have toxins from bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, then escaping into the bloodstream. And there's a spore-forming bacteria called Bacillus subtilis that's been shown to help basically break apart some of the pathogenic bacteria that you can find in the horse's digestive tract. So things like Rhodococcus equi, that have been shown to be problematic to horses. This spore-forming fungi actually secretes a protein that breaks those bacteria apart and before they can cause inflammation in the digestive tract. So that kind of an ingredient in the feeds that you're feeding can be very beneficial. And some of the higher end feed, that are on the market are using these kinds of ingredients in their products. So those are certainly, ingredients to be looking for on your ingredient list.
What else do we need to be feeding in a summer diet? Is there a supplement or something else that should be added to the diet during the heat?
I mean, chromium's a mineral, trace mineral, and it's been, shown to actually have some benefit in pigs in hot weather that are stressed. It's interesting. It improves insulin sort of action and uptake by you end up with more what are called GLUT4 receptors on your muscle tissue. So the muscles are more able to take glucose out of the bloodstream, which is important because horses that are heat stressed preferentially would rather use glucose as an energy source than fat. There's an interesting shift there, sort of partitioning of what what substrates are available for use when horses are heat stressed or animals in general are heat stressed. So if you can get the glucose into your muscle tissue more easily, that can be beneficial. And so chromium helps do that. There's also been research showing that chromium decreases serum cortisol. So cortisol is a hormone that is elevated during stress. We think of that as a stress hormone. But there is a study looking at pigs. I mentioned in our last episode that pigs are very sensitive to heat, and a fair amount of research has been done on heat stress in pigs. And so they fed some pigs some chromium and then a control diet with no chromium and exposed them to thermal neutral. So within their sort of, tolerated temperature range where they don't have to try and keep cool or keep hot. And then they also expose them to heat stress conditions. And they looked at the effect of chromium supplementation on their sort of feed intake and insulin-related metabolism and the like. And what they showed was that they also looked at rectal temperatures, and they showed that at thermal neutral, there really wasn't any difference between the pigs, whether they got chromium or not. But when you heat stress those pigs, there was a significant difference in their rectal temperatures with the, rectal temperature in the pigs that got chromium being significantly lower than the pigs that didn't get chromium. And then even more significant was the impact on their respiratory rate. So they looked at breaths per minute, the same research study, and they showed there was absolutely no difference between the chromium treated and the non-chromium treated pigs when they were in a thermal neutral environment. But when you heat stress them, there was a significant, it was, basically about 175 breaths per minute for the chromium treated pigs, and it was about 225 breaths per minute for the pigs that didn't receive chromium. So significant difference, and the chromium really seemed to be helping those pigs to handle the stress of the heat that they were exposed to better. So there are, a limited number of feeds out there on the market that have chromium in them. Now, I will say that was specifically chromium propionate, which is the only FDA-approved form of chromium available for use in horses in the United States. There are other forms of chromium that you see in supplements, but they're not FDA approved, and they don't have the research on them. So I only ever work with the form that has the research behind it, and is the FDA approved version for horses. There's been a lot of safety work done on that. For FDA to put their stamp of approval on it, they had to go through some pretty rigorous safety trials and things. So I specifically look for that version when I'm looking for products that have chromium in them. And if listeners are wanting to try to locate those products, that form of chromium is made by a company called Chemin. And if you go to Chemin's chromium page, they have a link there to all the products on the market that are using their chromium in them. So you'll see the feeds and supplements that are available that have that chromium in the US.
That's just what I was going to ask you. I was going to say, where can you even find that? Is it? But there you go. Go to the Chemin website. I'll put a link to that in the show notes so that if people are looking for it, it's in there.
Yeah.
I think this is an obvious one. Maybe it's not an obvious one. Salt and electrolytes. Yeah. So I feed salt every day, 365. There's never a day I skip feeding my salt, but lots of people don't feed salt loose every day. They just have a salt block. So let's start. Can you quickly explain the difference between salt and electrolytes?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned last time, like salt and electrolytes, they're the same thing in the sense that salt is, when we say salt, we're meaning sodium chloride. And sodium chloride, sodium and chloride are both electrolytes. So, there's definitely, that they are electrolytes. But when I'm talking about salt, I think of like table salt, sodium chloride that I'm putting in the horse's grain every day. When I'm talking electrolytes from a nutrition standpoint, I'm thinking about replacing the electrolytes that have been lost in sweat. So when I'm shopping for an electrolyte for my horse, I'm specifically looking for one that's going to replace sweat losses. So like you said, I recommend feeding sodium chloride every day, 365 days of the year, and at a rate of about 1 tablespoon per 500 pounds of body weight every day. And the purpose of that is to give the horse its maintenance sodium requirement on a cool day doing no work. So that's just, the sodium they need and the chloride they need to just keep themselves kind of functioning and wandering around, not doing any forced exercise. However, the moment they start sweating because of radiant heat and the sun's just beating on them and they're just sweating, or you work them and they start sweating heavily, now we need to replace those sweat losses because, as we talked about in the last episode, horse sweat is hypertonic and they lose huge amounts of electrolyte in their sweat. So now I'm going to be looking for an electrolyte to feed in addition to the salt that I give them every day. And initially, the main reason for doing a commercial electrolyte is they're generally just more palatable, right? That you can certainly feed more table salt, but it's not very palatable. Most people's horses don't want to eat that much salt. And there is, a good electrolyte is balanced to mirror the profile of sweat. So it actually has more chloride in it than any of the other electrolytes. More chloride, followed by sodium, followed by potassium. I don't worry so much about potassium generally, unless I'm dealing with endurance horses, because our forage-based diets tend to be quite high in potassium, like well over the NRC requirement if your horse is eating enough forage a day in the US. But a well-balanced electrolyte will provide all those three and may also provide some magnesium and some calcium because those are actually also electrolytes and are lost in small quantities in sweat. So generally speaking, you may see those also in a good quality electrolyte.
Let's just tell them the fun fact of how much the 2-pound salt block that you get your horse, the one that goes in the stall, the small one.
Yeah,
how much of that do they have to eat to meet the requirement?
Yeah, I mean, to meet your maintenance requirement, as I said, it's about 10 grams of sodium a day, which you get from an ounce of salt. So you'd be looking at doing, a pound of salt a month. If, so people always sort of say, oh, my horse has a salt block, which is great. Horses should absolutely have a salt block. I mean, I think Jill, I know you and I both put salt in our horses' bucket feed every day. My own horses also have salt blocks in their stalls. So they absolutely have a salt block, but I don't rely on their intake of that because most horses are not going to consume a pound of block salt every month or 2 pounds every 2 months and meet that maintenance requirement. So I would rather that peace of mind of knowing that they're getting that maintenance sodium requirement to help keep them drinking, decrease their dehydration. It is the cheapest colic insurance you can buy. And it's so cheap, right? And people always ask, what kind of salt? I mean, just literally regular table salt is fine. Like iodized is fine, unless you're feeding a supplement that has a lot of iodine in it, or kelp, because kelp is quite high in iodine. So generally, if you're feeding a kelp type product, I don't feed iodized salt. But have a block as well. But generally, horses don't consume enough salt off of a block to meet their maintenance requirement.
Right.
And they
if you've
will.
Had that,
Go ahead.
If you've had that salt block in your stall for 6 months and you haven't replaced it, your horse is not getting enough salt.
Well,
you just know that they're not.
Blocks. You should see the salt blocks I see. I mean, like, I've at times had those massive 50-pound ones, right? And you stick it in the corner of the stall and then they poop on it.
Right.
Or they're covered in spiders' webs. And you just think, they're clearly not using this. And why would they want to at this point? It's like covered in dust and poop and goodness knows what. So, yeah, I will say, and this is a hot weather thing, where I am, people really like those Himalayan salt on a rope. And in my, we keep our horses in what we call mare motels. So they're kind of like pipe pens. Because you get a lot of airflow through them. It's a very common type of stall situation in Arizona. And so people will hang them off the top, rail pipe of their pipe pen, which is great. And I once watched my daughter's pony, he was having a grand time, like playing with his Himalayan salt on a rope. He thought it was the best thing ever. And he was swinging it round and round. And then I suddenly looked at it and I suddenly thought, hang on a minute. Like if he actually wanted to lick this because he really needed salt, he'd have a heck of a time, because every time he would like push it with his nose to try and lick it, it was like swinging away from him. So I think it's great if you want to hang a salt block like that for enrichment, because it's something to do. He's a busybody, right? So anything he can do with his nose is great fun. Super, hang that like on that top rail for fun, but make sure you have some form of salt somewhere that isn't going to run away from them if they do try to go lick it. He's one that actually will lick a salt block in addition to having salt in his grain. And so I actually then moved that salt block and I moved it to where the horizontal top rail intersected with a vertical piece of pipe, and I hung it in kind of like around the vertical pipe, if that makes sense, so that the pipe was behind the block, so that he could, if he licked it, it had resistance behind it because there was a pipe behind it. Hopefully that makes sense to listeners. But
yeah,
Well,
I was going to say, if your horse doesn't like to eat the loose salt, because some horses don't like to eat it, and you're still trying to get it into them, don't start with the recommended. Start with a small amount and gradually increase it. But also, if you're not feeding wet, if you have wet feed, it's pretty easy. Just put it in there and it'll dissolve and it's in there. You can also just wet your bin before you dump your feed in, and then put your salt in and just shake your grain around and it'll stick to it. And then they're going to consume it. But isn't there some statistic about horses don't realize that they're dehydrated, like it's too late by the time they actually turn to their salt block?
Yeah, I don't know about the statistic, but I think that part of what keeps you drinking, right, is, think about it. You have chips, you go to a football game. You're an avid football fan, right? You have chips and salsa or something during a game. And then shortly thereafter, you're looking for an adult beverage, right? Because you're thirsty. And it's the salt that was on the chips that, has made you thirsty. And so that's what happens, is that your circulating sodium level went up in your bloodstream. And like many, many things in your body, your body registers that elevated sodium and goes, oh, danger, danger, sodium concentration is too high in the blood. We need to get more fluid into your bloodstream to dilute that. And so you're motivated to drink. So because horses have this such concentrated sweat, when they dump all the electrolytes out in their sweat, they lower their circulating sodium in their blood. And so now they don't have such a strong drive to drink. And what I find is, and in my last episode, I mentioned the advanced event horse that I worked with that wasn't drinking on the road or very well at competitions. And I think, what happened was that, she didn't realize she needed to drink because her circulating sodium was low because the owner wasn't actually feeding enough. She wasn't getting salt every day in her grain. She just got electrolytes periodically when she worked hard. And so I think that she was sort of riding at the low end of normal of sodium. And then when she did sweat, she dropped kind of like below, too low, and she lost her thirst reflex. And by giving her just those 2 tablespoons of salt every day, it elevated her circulating sodium requirements such that even when she did lose some in sweat, she was still high enough that she had a thirst reflex. And I think we've probably all heard the old, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And I've always just wondered whether that's because you've been out on your trail ride all day, your horse is sweaty, you get to a river or a lake and you say, hey, let's stand in here and let's get you a drink. And they stand there kind of going, wow, what a nice view, and staring off into the distance and not drinking. And you can't understand why they don't want to drink because they haven't had a drink in 3 hours because you've been out on the trail. And I just wonder whether it's because you've dumped all the sodium out in their sweat and they've lost their thirst reflex. They don't really realize they need to drink because their circulating sodium level isn't that high. So their body doesn't get that message that, need to dilute that.
Can they have too much sodium? Does anything happen, or is it just they urinate it out if it's too high?
They can. I mean, they will urinate it out. I mean, they will change all of their fluid dynamics and stuff and urinate that out. I mean, generally speaking, as long as your horse has access to adequate clean water at all times, we don't worry too much. I mean, I've had clients, put salt blocks. There is that odd horse that will literally consume the entire salt block in a day. So, okay, maybe they don't get a salt block, but if they are going through it, let's say they were going through, 2 pounds a month on their salt block or something, as long as they've got plenty of fresh water available, it's fine. I mean, it's always worth talking to your vet about, just to make sure there's nothing untoward going on. But the key is you always have to have clean water available.
When do I add electrolytes?
So electrolytes you're going to add to replace sweat loss. So you're going to give your salt 365 days of the year, and then your electrolytes you're giving specifically to replace sweat loss.
And am I doing electrolytes and salt on the same day?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can't, people think that they can like preload electrolytes. It doesn't work like that. So, I mean, the key is to have your horse in good, electrolyte status by giving the salt every day. And then, okay, yeah, I mean, give some, the morning you put them on the trailer and, while you're competing and what have you, but there's no benefit to like mega dosing electrolytes the morning you leave for a show or something. It just doesn't work like that. And you can, you have to be a little bit careful, because if your horse is dehydrated and you put a very concentrated electrolyte into their GI tract, you will actually pull, sodium attracts water, so you will pull fluid into the digestive tract out of the cells, and like completely the opposite of what you want, and can cause some problems. So the key is to have your horse in good electrolyte status, all the time, and don't suddenly try to play catch up and do crazy things all of a sudden because you weren't prepared.
Yeah. I just want to add that if you're shopping for an electrolyte, check the ingredients, because some of them do have a lot of sugar in them.
Yeah.
That makes them taste delicious instead of tasting like salt. But if you have a metabolic horse or one with insulin dysregulation, this is something that you're going to want to watch for.
Yeah, and I saw somebody locally posted a product on a local Facebook group here, some, miracle electrolyte that has all kinds of fibers in it. It's supposed to hold water in the gut and what have you. And I've never heard of it before. I was curious. I went and looked at it. And I think it was something like 3.4% sodium. and they didn't even guarantee the amount of chloride. And salt was the fifth ingredient. Dextrose was the first. Dextrose is sugar. Dextrose was the first ingredient. Then I had like pectin, an apple pomace fiber or something. And I'm like, what is this? Like, if for an electrolyte to be an effective sweat replacer, chloride needs to be the first ingredient, or salt, sodium chloride. It might just say salt. And you're really looking at upwards of 60% salt. I mean, it needs to be mostly salt. So yeah, all these products that have sort of, 3, 4, 5% in them, is like they're worthless. So.
Can we talk about feed storage in the summer? I know that a lot of people feed oil. I feed oil, and textured feeds, they have molasses or something sticky on them sometimes.
Yep.
What needs to be done in the summer? Like, does something have to change? Because obviously mold, things like that. So how are we storing all this in the summertime?
Yeah, I mean, some oils are really not heat stable, right? So our expensive omega-3 oils, like I feed a fish oil, that is not stable in the summer. So, I actually used to not feed it in the summer. I'd actually switched to ground stabilized flax. But when I was in my old bunks, I didn't have an enclosed tack room. Like all of our feed was just sort of in the back of the hay barn. Now, I've more recently I've been in barns that actually have tack rooms, and so I have kept feeding it over the summer. But yeah, you do have to be careful about rancidity of oils. If they get too hot, especially the omega-3 oils. So, thinking about how much you have in the barn at any given time, maybe, store it, most of it. I like buy a gallon at a time, but I'll just bring out, small amounts of the barn and not have it all sitting out there week after week after week, exposed to our ridiculous temperatures. Keeping it in the fridge is, some oils kind of do funny things when you keep them in fridges, and so that doesn't always work either. But climate control is certainly worth a consideration. And the mold is more of an issue in humidity, right? So if you have feed that's in, some feed companies use feed bags that are not very porous, perhaps isn't the right word, but like feed bags should allow it permeable. Yeah, let the air move in and out. It's one of the reasons why we don't put feed in sealed baggies. So we've talked about Pony Club before, but our listeners all know that Jill and I were both in Pony Club, and when our pony clubbers go to competitions, part of their horse management is they're not allowed to actually keep their grain in like Ziploc bags. And I know many, many of us, including myself, in boarding situations, make like a week's worth of baggies in Ziploc bags. But the problem with that is that they're sealed. And if you have a textured feed, like a higher molasses, higher oil type feed, or even just anything with a little more fat in it, and you put it in a sealed bag, in the summer, it can sweat because it's higher moisture. If it's a feed that's got like 15% moisture, it will sweat and mold. Which it won't do in the winter. So that's something that's really worth thinking about. Can you actually safely make that much feed in one go? One of our local pony clubs actually had a project where they made cloth grain bags, cotton grain bags with drawstring, kind of like the, what's that? They got the idea from Crown Royal bags. Like when you buy bags of Crown Royal liquor, they come in these like purple bags with the drawstrings.
Felt bags, yes.
Yeah, and their club leader figured out that those make great grain storage bags. So they actually copied, figured out how to make a cheap drawstring bag out of some cheap cotton and some, whatever. And they had it as a project, a club project, and they all made themselves great. I thought it was really clever. But Ziploc bags don't always work in the summer. You have to be a little bit cognizant of that. I've done that and after 5 days gone, oops, look at that, there's some mold in there. So
well, I think what you said was, at your previous facility that you were boarding at, that their feed room was not really a feed room. It was sort of at the back of the hay barn. So, not everybody's going to have an ideal situation or have, air conditioned or a heated feed room.
Right, for sure.
So just making sure that, where's the sun hitting that stuff? Like if it has direct sun, can you move it somewhere where it's going to be in a shadier spot in the summer during the hottest part of the time? Just try to make some adjustments to it if you can. Not everybody can.
And it's worth asking your feed store how they store the feed. Right. So, I've been in some great feed stores that have climate controlled rooms that they keep the feed in. I've been in some feed stores where there is no climate control for the feed. Right. And so it's sitting there for however many weeks until somebody buys it. If they don't have good turnover, that feed could have been sitting there for a month or two before you buy it. And if it's not climate controlled, what state is it in, especially if the bags are not bags that are particularly don't allow airflow. So things to think about.
This is why you keep your grain bag, because the manufacturer information is on the tag at the bottom. Right. And if it is moldy, you need to contact them.
Yeah. I mean, most feed stores, if you just call the feed store and say, hey, I bought this, it's got mold in it, they'll replace it. But if you get pushback from your feed store, absolutely call the feed company, because, they want to make sure that it reflects badly on them, even if it's not actually the feed company directly that's at fault. So yeah, absolutely. Don't ever feed moldy feed.
Right. Feed tubs, buckets, flies. I freaking hate flies. I hate flies more than anything. Anyway,
feed rooms, but yeah.
The buckets and your feed tubs, even if you're not making wet food, they still need to be cleaned out, your feed tubs, because especially if you're feeding alfalfa or feeding some type of pellets, you can see in the bottom of your feed tubs all the saliva that has come out of the horse's mouth. Mm-hmm. And if those just sit in the stalls all day, lots of bugs have been on them, breeding, doing
I did, again, at one of my old barns, I did a lot of research into fly mitigation because we had quite a big fly problem. And it was really interesting actually reading the molasses that's, in your feed really is a great fuel source for your flies, right? They love it. So you can really feed up your fly population nicely with your feed that has some molasses, sprayed on it, which is not a reason not to feed that feed. It just means that you need to have good, kind of quality control. So we would notice, sometimes people would, it gets a bit boring making grain baggies, right, or whatever, and people wouldn't be paying attention and they'd spill some sweet feed on the ground or whatever. And you would walk in the feed room, it was just like covered in flies. Or buckets that were hung in the stall in the morning, and the horse, some of those like square-sided hanging buckets are hard for the horses to lick out really well, or just maybe the horse isn't that motivated, and you get, especially soaked, if you're soaking pellets or doing beet pulp or whatever, sometimes, and you don't have a super motivated horse. My thoroughbred's a little bit like that. Like, he's a little bit of a grazer. And sometimes the wet feed gets stuck around the corners of the buckets, and he's just not that motivated to get it out. And then it sits there and it's just there all day until he gets his evening grain, potentially, and it's just helping to feed the fly population. So I'm really lucky. I'm in a barn now where, they get their grain, and if once, about an hour later, if they're not done, the buckets get emptied and they get washed out every day. So the buckets are immaculate. It's definitely, I've been in barns where you walk along, you tap the bucket, and they just like swarm of flies out of them. It's disgusting.
Well, I was going to say, like, I feed wet hay because my horse has respiratory issues. And so I have a trough, one of those big Rubbermaid, I don't know, it's 10 inches off the ground. It's not a tall one. And I have that in his stall with his wet hay net in it to keep the water contained. And in the morning, the wet hay net is still damp in there, and the water that is dripped out and bits of hay. And if I don't pull that out and rinse it, one, it smells like a brewery. You smell all the fermenting hay, and then not so much flies, but gnats. It's like fruit flies everywhere. And so I pull that out every morning, rinse it out. I have a bleach and water solution that I spray in there and rinse it out. But that's something else. If your feet, if you have wet hay nets, like I hang my hay nets in the morning so that they're dry by the time I use them again.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those things that are wet that have any type of feed on them, you're just attracting more flies.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said before, the fly population, is making your horses stomp, then they're burning calories and costing you money because then you have to feed them more feed. I think that it's, also worth mentioning if you've got horses that have to have soaked feed, like beet pulp or pellets because of dental issues and things, like, it will start fermenting, right? I mean, it's like beet pulp. If you let it sit too long and soak too long, it starts to smell like wine or vinegar, which is a sure sign that it's kind of gone off. So, you might get away with, and I remember being, we used to feed a lot of soaked beet pulp as a kid, and, we would make it in the evening and it would sit all night, and we'd probably make like a big bucket of it, like 5-gallon bucket of it, and it would last for like 2 days. But it was, temperature never got above about 40 degrees. And so it was totally fine. But you can't do that in the summer. You can't, it's going to start going off, potentially between morning and evening kind of thing. So you may have to adjust your feeding practices and do things differently in the summer to make sure that you're not, feeding things that have started going off.
You brought that up in the winter here when I was making beet pulp, and you were like, you probably don't want to make that much up ahead of time because it's going to go bad. I'm like, it's 32 degrees in my feed room.
Yeah,
it's not going to go bad.
Right.
It might freeze.
It might freeze if you're going at it with a chip, like a pickaxe or something to try and get it out. Hey, Dash, here's a sugar beet popsicle.
It's delicious, I guarantee.
Actually, no joke. Talking about popsicles, one of my friends whose horses stopped sweating, and we were trying to figure out how to get salt into him. She actually made like salty popsicles for her horse, and he loved them. Like, so she would take like a Tupperware container,
watermelon,
and she would put bits of apples and carrots and things in there, and she made the water slightly salty, and she put a piece of baling twine through it. And she would hang it up and he would lick it. I mean, obviously it melted pretty quickly, but it was just kind of a fun enrichment type opportunity for, if you're looking for something fun to do. And it doesn't have to be salty water. It could just be regular water, but popsicles for horses to play with.
Oh, I thought you were going to say watermelon, because horses love watermelon, and you can easily put salt on that and it absorbs right in and they munch away at it when you put it onto the rind.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
sure.
That's another thing.
Yeah.
Water buckets, water troughs, water everything. Also another way for the flies. So I dump my water buckets every morning, and I have a toilet bowl cleaner brush that I use to clean my water buckets and that I clean my tub with. And I find that to be super easy to just like you're cleaning the toilet, wring it around the bucket a few times. It takes any, dirt off. You can give them a good rinse. Mm-hmm. And then I also use Listerine in my outside tub. When I clean it out, I give it a rinse with that. And then I put a little bit in before I fill it in the summer, which definitely helps. I don't think it does anything for the flies, but it does. I think it helps with the algae and the water lasting longer without the algae growing as quickly. And one thing to think about with when I moved to this property, I set my water tub out in my paddock. There was easy for me to get to with the hose.
Right.
And it kept growing algae, and I was like, why is this so bad? Well, I set it somewhere where it was getting sun all day. So if there is somewhere in your paddock that you can get the water to that's going to get some shade on it, that might help your water not get as dirty or grow so much algae.
Yeah, that and the fact that if it gets too warm, horses won't drink it. Right. So not such an issue for you because your ambient temperature doesn't get as hot as here. But here we run into the problem, especially if you're doing like 5-gallon buckets. The larger the volume of water, the cooler it stays, right? But when you've got 5-gallon buckets and it's 110 degrees out, that water gets pretty warm. I know somebody who actually, makes they make big ice blocks, and they actually will put ice blocks in their horses. Like they have muck buckets that they use for their horses' water. And she will actually put, a block, sort of a sizable block of ice every day in her horse's water buckets mid-afternoon, which, she has the luxury of doing that because she lives close, she lives at home with her horses, and she's home, so she can do that. But yeah, thinking about where you put your buckets so that they don't get so hot that the horses won't want to drink them is important. And then thinking too about if they're big, like how are you going to clean them regularly if they're quite large? So we don't hang 5-gallon water buckets, but we do have muck buckets that we use for water in our stalls, and our barn owner has one of those little carts that you put them in, and she knows how much the horses drink each day, and they get down to about a quarter full, and then she can lift that and get it in the cart to drag it off, and then she dumps it under the trees before cleaning and rinsing it and putting it back in and filling it back up again. So you have to kind of think about how empty they're going to get, how soon you're going to be able to kind of clean them, and how you're going to get them to where you need to get them to clean them out, kind of thing. But water buckets. And something in the summer here we run into is there's nearly always like that horse in the barn that likes to dunk their hay. And in the winter it's not such a big problem, but in the summer, I mean, it can get rank, and like biofilms start forming on the water, like if they're not cleaned out frequently. I've seen buckets where there's so much hay in the bucket you can't actually see the water. I mean, that can happen between morning and evening if you've got a horse that's a really confirmed dunker. I always suggest feed your hay away from the water buckets if you've got a horse that's a dunker, or hang and have multiple sources of water. So maybe hang him a bucket by his hay that he can dunk the hay in, and then have a second source of water that's away from the hay, so that he hopefully has his real water source is further away from the hay and stays clean. It is always worth kind of pondering, why is your horse dunking their hay? Is it a dental? I mean, generally they're softening the hay, right? I mean, it's a great thing. They're getting more water in them. So on the one hand, awesome, right? But like, is it because they're struggling to chew dry hay? They're trying to soften it so they can chew it? Is it, I would, if your horse hasn't had dental work done in the last 6 months and they suddenly start dunking their hay, I'd be wanting to make sure their teeth don't need doing. Do they have some gastrointestinal distress, like ulcers or whatever, and the hay is irritating the lining of the gut, and they're trying to make it softer? Is your hay quality such that it could be a little softer? Maybe they wouldn't dunk their hay quite so much then. So I do recommend kind of thinking a little bit about why they're doing it. Some horses just love doing it, and it's just a habit, and great, but don't think about it a little bit before just writing it off as being sort of an idiosyncrasy that your horse is, just likes dunking his hay.
My friend had 2 little kids that had to help with chores, and their job was to clean the water buckets every day. Yeah. That was their thing. She would unhook them all and put them in so that the kids just had to clean them out, and then she'd hang them back up. And so the one time she could tell that they weren't cleaned very well. Right. And so she filled them, and she asked the kids to go over and drink the water, and they wouldn't. And it was because they hadn't cleaned them well enough. So they learned really quickly.
Yeah. Gotcha.
After that, they were very good little bucket cleaners to make sure that water, because you never knew when you were going to be asked to taste it. So it's just something to keep in mind. If you're not drinking the water, your horse isn't going to drink the water either.
That's funny. Yeah. And something I didn't, talking about hay, which I didn't mention earlier, we talked about, maybe, thinking about how much hay you're feeding, and do you need to maybe feed a little bit, calories from some more readily available source. But, one thing I didn't mention was, consider the quality of the hay that you're feeding. Unless there's a reason for you to be feeding stemmier or less digestible hay. And what made me think about this was, talking about horses with dental issues, or, but if the hay is stemmy and it's irritating the gut lining, for those hay dunkers, in general, summer can be a time, to feed, a better quality hay that's easier to digest. There won't be as much, fermentation heat being generated. But obviously, if you have an insulin-resistant pony, or a pony who's a little overweight, or any horse is a little overweight, and you're feeding that stemmier, more mature hay because you're regulating sugar intake or trying to keep as much forage in front of them as possible without them getting fat, then, that maybe doesn't apply to you. And like all things with horses, you have to kind of assess the risk benefit of, certain management strategies, but something to think about. in the summer, if you have the access to have be feeding a hay that's a little better quality, there'll be a little less heat load associated with that.
Something else that we didn't talk about in the last episode that probably should have went into the last episode was about humidity. We briefly talked about humidity because I live in the Corn Belt.
You and your Corn Belt, yeah.
And here on the news in the morning, when the corn is already up, so we're looking at the end of July, August, it is normal on the news for them to talk about the dew point, which I know in a lot of areas that is not something they talk about. So do you want to talk really quickly about relative humidity and how that
I'm
is
glad
with
you
horses?
didn't say, do you want to talk about dew point? Because I am not the person to talk to about dew point. Like, I know that's a thing, but like, I've never had to do anything with dew point, right? So I'm like, huh, what? I'm more used to thinking like relative humidity, right? And how that affects, like, I think like those heat index charts that you see. So you'll have temperature on one axis and humidity on the other, right? And so as you go up in temperature, if the relative humidity goes up, then it makes it feel much hotter, right? So it might be, 90 degrees and 10 degrees relative humidity it feels like 90 degrees. It's not, it's fine. But if it's 90 degrees and it's like 55% relative humidity, well, now it feels like, closer to 100 or whatever. And so it creates a greater level of heat stress. And I think, when we didn't talk about this last time, why it's important to both humans and horses is that you're at greater risk of suffering heat stress during high humidity, because to your point, when the humidity is high and you've got a lot of moisture in the air, then evaporation isn't going to work so well. So the reason why evaporation works as a cooling strategy is that you're wet, your skin is wet, your horse's skin is wet, the air is dry, and so then that moisture can move into the dry air, and the dry air sort of like wicks that moisture off the horse and takes the heat with it. And if the air is very humid and already saturated in moisture, it's not able to take more moisture off your horse. It's not able to, move that sweat, that moisture from the sweat, and therefore you don't have the cooling effectiveness of sweating. And so horses in humid climates are at greater risk of overheating than if they're at the same temperature in a less humid climate. And like 90-degree day at your house and a 90-degree day at my house, your horse is probably more likely to get heat stress than mine is, because it'll probably be like 10 degrees humidity here and it could be 70 degrees humidity at your house.
Right.
So there's a greater risk of overheating actually for you in Iowa than there is for me in Arizona on that particular day. Now, I will just say, if it's 118 degrees out, like it is here in the summer sometimes in Phoenix, doesn't matter if it's only 20% humidity. I mean, that is just really hot, right? So, it doesn't matter that the humidity is fairly low. The heat stress is the same. So it is worth looking at. I actually really like, is it OSHA that has an app? There's a great like heat stress app that you can, for your location, it calculates it all for you, and it tells you if you're at a high, like low risk, moderate risk, high risk, like has a needle on a chart kind of type thing. It's a very good graphic. And I use it in the summer sometimes just to kind of judge, because it's made for people that are out working in outdoor type jobs, like doing farming and those kinds of things, or construction, to determine what their health risk is. And it's a pretty neat little app.
So, and I think something else just to say about that, if you live in the desert or you live in the Southwest or somewhere that's a dry heat, and you are traveling to a show, we ride dressage, so I'm just going to use this as an example, that people go to Kentucky or they go to Chicago to Lamplight in the summer. Your horses are not used to being in that humidity, and you're taking them from an environment that's had a 10% or a 15% humidity to somewhere that might be 80-90% humidity. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, that they may not adjust as well or as quickly.
Absolutely.
So
we lucked out last summer. I mean, we took my daughter's pony to Kentucky for Pony Club National Championships, and we got him very fit before we went. As I mentioned in the last episode, one of the things that can lead to heat stress is the horse not being fit enough for the work being done, which includes, and that includes being in the climate, that they're not fit enough for the climate they're going to work in. And so we got him way fitter than he needed to be to go do a dressage test. But part of that was so that he'd be better able to handle the conditions if it was humid. And, we do generally work, in the morning. We try to avoid the heat as much as possible. I learned a long time ago when I was eventing and living in Northern California, I used to go ride. I'd be done by 8, 9 in the morning. I thought that was hot. I mean, it was, was kind of in the high 90s, low hundreds. And I try to avoid the heat. I go out ride first thing in the morning. Went to an eventing competition in the fall. It was like September. And we had one of those like flash weekends where we had this like spike in temperature. And I got like a 2 in the afternoon dressage time, and I just about died. I was so hot. As I realized we had not, I mean, it was probably a good 15 degrees hotter than we had ridden all summer, because I'd been avoiding it all summer and making a point
Right.
of not riding in it. So, as we've said the last 2 episodes, like, you have to be really careful not to overdo it. And you have to be really careful how, you don't overstress your horses and get them over hot, and pay attention to the temperature. But if you are, to your point, planning on going to a climate where it could be quite hot to compete, getting your horses fit appropriately for the conditions is really important.
Well, we covered a lot in this episode. Is there anything else that you want to add, or you think that people should
I
know
feel like
about?
there's something, I didn't talk about butyric acid.
Okay, let's talk about butyric acid. That sounds thrilling.
It is thrilling. It's very cool.
Tell us all about butyric acid.
Well, butyric acid is a volatile fatty acid. There's a mouthful for you. So it's actually a byproduct of microbial fermentation. So when your horse ferments his hay or pasture or beet pulp, whatever forage, they release, the bugs in the hindgut release a number of volatile fatty acids. And one of those is butyric acid. And it's a really beneficial compound. It's very useful for supporting the lining of the gastrointestinal tract. And obviously, it's normally only available in the hindgut because that's where it's being produced. But now it is available as a feed additive. So companies add it to their feeds, which makes it available throughout the length of the digestive tract. And it's often combined with zinc, kind of all packaged up together. Zinc is also very important for epithelial cell health. And, it's been shown to have some really good sort of beneficial properties. So it helps with, the development of the intestinal tract lining. So if you've got damage, it's going to help get that fixed as quickly as possible. Those tight junctions I was talking about, where the cells, I think it was the last episode, pretending if you've got fists and you put your fists together and that's the lining of your gut lining and it drifts apart and you end up with a leaky gut. Butyric acid has been shown to help improve those tight junctions, those cell linings, keeping them nice and strong. It also increases the antioxidant levels in the gut lining, which helps promote healing. So if you, if your gut lining does come under insult from, heat stress or whatever, that oftentimes the damage requires, antioxidants, and the butyric acid will help with that. It also plays a role in your immune response and helps reduce inflammation. So all those things we talked about in the last episode that are going on in your GI tract when you have heat stress, butyric acid helps to mitigate that. So it's a really useful ingredient to have in the feed that you're feeding your horse. So worth a mention, I thought.
Where did you say where is that in feeds, like in commercial feeds, or is that a supplement?
Yeah, it's you'll see it in feeds and an ingredient list. You'll see it as butyrate. I'm seeing it more in more and more supplements now too. You might see it as butyric acid or butyrate. More commonly, you'll see it listed as butyrate. And so there are some gut supplements that have it in it, and there are some feeds that have it in it. It's actually another ingredient that's made by Kemin. And again, like on their website for that ingredient, they list all the manufacturers that are using that ingredient in their products. So I'm sure there are other people that make butyric acid, but that's the one I'm familiar with.
Again, we'll put a link in the show notes for Chemin so that you can look for that product if you need butyric acid.
Yeah, they do not sell, just to kind of explain, Chemin do not sell directly to horse owners. Chemin is an ingredient supplier. They supply companies who then put their ingredients in their finished products. So you would be buying the finished products with that ingredient in it.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you for that. And now everybody knows about butyric acid.
Yeah, I'm done now, for real, I promise.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.